I'll speak from over here, so you have this effect of like looking over there and then looking over here like you're at a tennis match. Before I start, I do want to thank Blair County Historical Society's past president, a great friend and my personal friend, Jared Frederick, for securing these facilities. If you know anything about local history, you know Jared's work with local history has been long and had a great impact, so we thank him for getting these facilities. And if you're wondering about the mask, I was going to say it's because he's newly clean shaven, but he has a cold right now and he's kind enough not to want to spread it to anyone. So thank you again for securing these wonderful facilities. Now, without any further ado, let me introduce tonight's speakers. Jody Stauffer has dedicated her life professionally to caring for children, particularly with those with communication difficulties. She has parlayed that interest into researching the Martinsburg Indian School and giving voice to that story. Her co-presenter tonight is Frank Vitelli. He is the University Archivist and Special Collections Manager and Librarian at Millersville University, which I'll just let that go because that's a rival of my alma mater, but we won't hold that against him. And he has spent his research time looking into the Indian boarding schools in Pennsylvania with a special focus on medicine and mortality. So if you would please welcome with me our guest speaker.
Thank you everyone so much. Can everybody hear me? Awesome, wonderful. It's so great to see so many people. I wish so many people came to all of my classes normally over at Millersville. So today, Jody and I are going to be talking about a chapter in Blair County history that, quite frankly, not a number of people really know. So as a brief little test here, because, you know, I am a teacher, so I'm going to do a little bit of a test. Has anyone, before hearing about this lecture, ever heard of the Martinsburg Indian Training School? Oh, wow. More people than I thought. That's awesome. Wonderful. So today we're going to be going over a little bit about the school's history and then contextualizing what that sort of looks like outside of just the town of Martinsburg. And we'll go into that a little bit. But before we do, we'd like to sort of introduce ourselves and our sort of background into this research.
So, can you hear me? Yes. Good. I have a really quiet voice. I'm thankful for a microphone. I was originally a Blair County resident, graduating from Hollidaysburg, got married, went off to Center County, and lived up in the Penn State main campus area for many years. I'm a speech pathologist by trade. I'm also an English as a second language teacher, and I've done adoption work. But basically, as Jim said, my focus has been on children, how to care for them, and especially how to help them communicate. Why am I interested in this topic? We adopted a young man who we learned later in his life had Native American heritage. So I began researching that with him and discovered this interesting part of our history where boarding schools occurred for those Native American children. And as I learned more about it, my heart for children to be able to communicate well was saddened when I realized that many of those young people lost their actual native tongue and were basically asked to learn English very, very quickly and often penalized for not learning English. Later on, when I moved to Martinsburg, I realized that there was actually an Indian boarding school in our community, and one of the people who helped me understand that is sitting here, and I'm very thankful for him for letting me know about it. So I, along with my co-researcher, Corey Bolger, and we'll talk about her a little bit in a bit, we were able to bring the actual local piece to the history, dig into some of the local archives, into the Martinsburg Herald, into the Altoona papers, and some documents. So I'll be sharing about that piece, the Martinsburg actual local piece, and Frank is going to do much more of the bigger context. So thank you.
So to sort of explain where I come into this this work is through my work as a historian. So I have worked for the last 10 years or so researching Indian boarding schools in the state of Pennsylvania. The one that everyone has heard about, if you've heard about any of these institutions, is the Carlisle Indian Industrial School out in Carlisle, Cumberland County, Pennsylvania. That is where Jim Thorpe went. And it is one of the first schools of this type. We'll talk about Carlisle just a little bit, but as I was researching that institution, I kept finding mentions of Martinsburg. And it seemed very odd to me because this wasn't a school that really anyone had done any sort of research on, so I started doing a little bit of digging on my own, and then through a mutual connection, connected with both Jody and Corey. I tried to mix their names there, that didn't work very well. And Corey, who is on Zoom with us down here, but is not able to present with us today, is the vital sort of third piece in our research collaboration. Corey is Martinsburg born and raised. Her family has been in this region for generations, and Corey just recently relocated out to Wyoming, so she wasn't able to be with us today, but Corey and Jody were doing so much of the research work locally while I was doing some of the more national level research work, and it really has been an important collaboration, and we don't want to forget Corey's role in this. The other thing that I want to point out just as we go through these introductions is the fact that we are in a region that has a very long-standing history that predates European settlement. So this is the ancestral homeland of the Susquehannock peoples, but we are actually on the edge of ancestral homelands of multiple different groups, including the Osage, which we will be talking about just a little bit later in the presentation. Center County, where Jody spent a lot of her time, is also in the Susquehannock region. Lancaster County, which is where I am based, is also in the Susquehannock region, and I originally grew up in the Philadelphia region, which is part of the Lenape-Hoking, which is the ancestral homelands of the Lenape. So these are lands that really only had European settlers in them for a couple of generations before this school comes to be, and that's really important to recognize, is that the colonialization that happens in this region removes most all indigenous peoples from these lands by 1800. And so that really has an impact on the way that this school is received by the community, which is something that we'll talk about a little bit later on. So as Jody mentioned, we're going to be starting by talking about Martinsburg on the sort of micro level, looking at the school itself and the town of Martinsburg, before we sort of expand out and we look a little bit at Blair County and how the school interacts within the greater Blair County area. And then we're going to take it outside of Blair County to the state and to the American Empire, the rest of what we now consider to be the United States, but at this time was still very much a expanding colonial empire.
And I think what we'll do is hold questions to the end, because often you've thought of something that we're going to say very shortly. So we'll try to talk to about 7 o'clock. We think we have so much to share, and we can be verbose. So we'll be watching you, and if you're falling asleep and yelling, we'll speed it up and get to the questions. So I'm going to be talking with you about the who, the what, the where, the when, but I want to ask first, do we have any Martinsburg residents here or former Martinsburg residents here? Oh, there's more than I expected. Okay. So I'm assuming you know a little bit about the who, what, where, and when. All right. So I'm going to be setting the story for today within the town of Martinsburg in the 1880s. At that time, Martinsburg population was only 567 people. During the first year of the school, which was in 1885, there were 89 youth from 2 separate Native American tribal nations, and I'll talk about them in a bit, came to the boarding school. meaning about 1 in every 6 people who walked on the streets of Martinsburg were of Native American heritage. In contrast to today, our population in Martinsburg, according to the 2020 census, is about 1,874 people. Over 99% are Caucasian, 0.04% Native American. So a very different venue. Back there, 1 out of 6, now barely 1 out of 100. So I'm going to share information about the building itself. And often when we talk about this in Martinsburg, people know where the building was. They know of the building. They know very little about the school. I'll talk about the principal or superintendent of the building and his family. I'll be telling you a little bit about the townspeople, their reactions to having these young people with them. And I think that's it. Yes. Okay, so let's go, excuse me, to the place itself. Those of you from Martinsburg may have known it as the seminary. Is that true of Martinsburgers? Is that the term you may have most commonly heard in this? Yeah. And why was it called the seminary? I'm just going to give you a brief history of the place itself before it became the boarding school. It became so many other things after that point. In fact, I'll share a little bit with you about that. It was conceived of back in the 1860s, late 1860s, by a group of 12 gentlemen who wanted to bring a private preparatory school to Martinsburg. So at that time, many people went to school to about 8th grade. If you wanted to go on to college, you needed a preparatory experience. So they decided to create a private school, and they began that endeavor. But unfortunately, it just never really did very well. So for about 7 years, they gave that a try. It didn't work. It was sold to the Lutheran Synod, who wanted to create it into a seminary. And that was where the term seminary came from. That only lasted for a year. I'm not sure what happened to that endeavor. It was sold back to an educator who ran it as, again, a preparatory school. And at that time, it was called Juniata Collegiate Institute. So you may have heard that, those of you from Martinsburg too. It has nothing to do with Juniata College. So people start to get confused about that, not related at all. That endeavor occurred for about 4 or 5 years. It wasn't doing very well, and it was sold to the person who eventually becomes the superintendent of the building, the Breidenbach family. And I'll be talking about the Breidenbachs themselves in a little bit. I think that's what I want to share with you about the building. So let's go on to the next slide. Let's see how I do here. Did I point it toward here?
There we go.
Technology is not good to me. Okay, a current map of Martinsburg, and Frank said I have a pointer, but then you're gonna have to see if I can do right and left. Okay, we'll see how this goes. Those of you who are familiar with Martinsburg, you may know Mamie's Cafe and Bakery. How many of you have been there? Okay, that's what we figured, which is why we put it on there. So on that vantage point, this is like the one and only light in Martinsburg when you come in. Mamie's is right here. As we continue up the street, there was a large parcel of land, and this is where the actual seminary building was built. It's no longer there though, and we'll tell you the story of that. Across the street is Morrison's Cove Memorial Park, and you may have been there as well. So I'm not very good at doing this part. I'm putting it to that. This is actually a map from 1873, and Randy Stoltz gave me a wonderful copy of it, and there it actually shows the Juniata Collegiate Institute. This is pre it becoming the boarding school, but we actually get to see where it was located. Mamie's is about in here, And we just circled two little portions of the Martinsburg map. It has the name of townspeople, it has the names of businesses in the area. We know that right here, I may have these mixed up, here we go. This was a physician who actually tended the children at the school. And this is the father of Mrs. Breidenbaugh, who was a tinsmith and actually helped with vocational instruction at the school. What do we do? Let's see.
There you go.
Yay, okay. So this is Philip Breidenbaugh, the proprietor, and he has always spoken out as Professor Philip P.H. Breidenbaugh. Again, not a college level professor, but back in that time, secondary educators at the high school level were frequently called professors. Let me just give you a little background information about him. Sorry. He was originally born in the Seeking Valley area. His father was a very prosperous farmer. In the 1850s, he was born. About 20 years later, his family came into the Morrison's Cove area. They eventually bought the building where the seminary was. He was actually a student at the Juniata Collegiate Institute as he prepared for his college work at Franklin and Marshall. He became an educator, came back, was the principal of the Juniata Collegiate Institute for a while, and then in about 1884, he came up with the idea that he wanted to add to the people who were already attending the school, the prep school, he wanted to add in the idea of education of Native youth. And I'm going to read a little bit about his ideas about that a little bit later. But he was a deacon in the Reformed Church at the time. He was a council person. He had political aspirations. After the boarding school ended, he did try for a political career, which did not go too far. It was more on the local level. He was a council person in Martinsburg as well. He also was a business person and a farmer. So that's a little bit about Philip. Yikes.
I don't know. Oh, there you go.
Yeah, I think I'm going to have Frank,
That's fine. I
my
can do it.
slide
Yep,
person,
that's
I'm
fine.
sorry.
Oh, you're good.
Okay, this is Philip's wife, Catherine Hassler Oleg Breidenbaugh, also known as Katie. She was born in the mid-1850s, lived about 5 years after her husband's death. She was the daughter of Louis Oleg, as we told you, and she was known for a beautiful voice, and she was an organist in the area. So to the boarding school itself, she brought the gift of music, teaching the Native Americans some keyboarding skills, singing hymns with them, and helping them to enjoy at least our colonial type of music at the time. She also was a very busy mother. She had 14 children, 12 of them lived during the time of the school. One died in infancy, and I think one died maybe in their 40s. Of the living children, none of them live in the Blair County area, so we're often asked, do any of the descendants live there? No. We have begun to find them around the United States, and we've had correspondence with them, but none are in Blair County. There are relatives to Philip Breidenbaugh's brother in the area. Those of you who know Breidenbaugh's farm market, that is a brother to Philip and his descendants. Right. Thanks. Why was the Indian training school started? It's a curious thing because as Frank said, there were really no Native Americans living in that area at the time. So what was Philip Breidenbaugh thinking? I have some quotes to read to you, so let me catch up in my notes. We have a really awesome article that we found in the Martinsburg Herald in 1885, which is when the school began. It was written about 7 months after the school started, and it started in April of 1885. On the front page of the Herald is an entire page, excuse me, I'm going to scoot in front of you. And I had to cut and paste this to put it all together because we expanded it. But the entire front page talking about the school itself. And this is one of our best resources from Philip Breitenbach's words, because he wrote this of what is the school and why did he start it and what is it all about. Okay, so let's try for a little fuller picture of what he had to say in this. He begins the article recounting an assignment he had as a student to memorize a speech given by William Penn. And he talked about the fact that this was a speech that was given in the Philadelphia area under the great elms. He talked about how in the speech there was a statement at the very end that really struck him, and that statement was, "We," meaning the whites, "and the Indians are the same, as if one man's body were to be divided into 2 parts. We are all one flesh and blood." He went on to talk about an educator named John Eliot, who had done quite a lot to help in some way with education of the Native Americans. And he quoted John Eliot's stance, but he called it civilizing the Indians. We'll be talking more about that. By furnishing the men with tools for gardening and implementing implements for agriculture, and the women to be taught general housework and other housekeeping skills. This laid the groundwork of Breitenbach's belief that a boarding school he would run would have both an academic learning piece and also a vocational piece. And Frank is going to share more with you about that. So within the article, it went on to say, "We have taken special care to instill in their useful minds the great importance of preparing themselves for a useful and independent life. That it is not manly or brave to depend upon annuities from the government, but that the Indian must get beyond and above the idea of issue of supplies, and by education, industry, and self-independence, be willing and eager to maintain himself and build for himself a family altar around which may be seen contentment and happiness." He later ended the article with, "We believe that the Indian has a right to return to the lands of the East and live amongst us. Certainly, he is prepared for this, and he will soon understand the benign influences of our state and national institution." Now, Frank is going to talk about that issue later on, but I wanted you to get a feel for what Philip was saying at the time and what his heart was at the time. All right, next.
So those are a lot of great flowery words. Let's actually think a little bit about why he may actually have been thinking about creating a school here in Martinsburg. So in 1879, the Carlisle Indian Industrial School is established. It's established by a U.S. Army officer who has been fighting wars out on the American West, and he makes a political argument to Congress and to politicians that the best way to deal with these conflicts in the American West, where white settlers are clashing with indigenous peoples for their land, is not through warfare, but rather through education. His motto for the Carlisle School is to kill the Indian in him and save the man. His idea is that by assimilating indigenous youth into the Euro-American polity, they're not going to fight anymore. This is also a period where just after the Civil War, there are labor shortages because all of the slave labor now has to be paid. And so having a workforce of individuals who are trained to be agricultural workers, trained to work in factories, but who can be paid less than white individuals is extremely advantageous to the American government. That is the sort of national scope of what's happening at the time. The Carlisle Indian School is very popular amongst politicians operating in the 1880s. And it becomes a very easy model for schools that are struggling in rural areas that don't have the populations to support a full-blown school to also try to gain a way of financial benefit for themselves. So if we think back to those stats that Jody mentioned at the very top about Martinsburg being a town of about 500, it's kind of hard to run a profitable school in a town of 500 people where the majority are adults and they don't need education. And even extending into Blair County, the population just can't sustain all of the small schools that exist. So Breidenbaugh, who has all of these political connections, goes, well, the federal government is looking to run more of these schools, and they're going to pay me a per capita. They're going to pay me a certain amount of money for each student that I can bring to this institution. So it makes sense for Breidenbaugh to be doing this, especially because in the middle of the 1880s, an economic recession hits. And so all of a sudden, this is the best way that he can think of to make this school that his family has purchased profitable. And that's something that we'll talk about a little bit later on.
Okay, we're going to go back to another piece of the Who. You've heard a little bit about the superintendent and his wife and their children, and they actually lived in the building itself. They lived there among the Native American students, and for a short amount of time, there were Caucasian students who were working through their prep school experience, and they lived together for a short amount of time. Then that piece of it faded away, and it was only a boarding school for a period of time after that. So arrived the United Youth in March of 1885. Breidenbaugh had a contract then with the American government. He was given a contract for 50 youth to come and live at the building. And the building was big enough to be able to board 80 different students of both genders. And when it was the Juniata Collegiate Institute, there was a female wing and a male wing. So they had that capability. What we learned, though, is how were they brought from the Oneida Reservation to Pennsylvania. So at the time, there were actually mission schools operating up on the reservation. So it's not as if these students had not had some degree of education. They were going in some parcel, I guess, to the mission schools. Breidenbaugh himself rode on a train from Pennsylvania up to De Pere, Wisconsin. The Green Bay Agency is where the reservation was. He collected them. I don't know exactly what that means to Breidenbaugh, but we know a little bit that he asked for the principals of the mission schools to suggest people, students, families who would be willing to send their children to Pennsylvania. He also used what's called the Indian Reservation Police to collect them. We don't have any further details about that. We just know there was a collection process. They came to the train and they were placed on the train. There were supposed to be 50, only 49 ended up on the train. What we learned about later is one child escaped from the train, likely went back to his family. When everybody arrived back in Martinsburg, Breidenbaugh actually required that that child come, and that child actually was placed on the train. He was about 8 or 9 years old by himself, and he rode to Martinsburg. He then left again with a classmate, and they made it all the way back to Wisconsin. So this was a very determined young man not to in Martinsburg. A little bit more about this. The gender is we had 31 boys, 18 girls. The ages are interesting, 7 or 8, because I think maybe in your mind as you think of who are these students, there were some young ones, but most of them were teenagers. And in the Osage tribe, which we'll talk about later, there are some as old as 27 years old. As a special educator, that really caused a little light to go off in my mind, thinking, why was a 27-year-old sent to a school where very primary levels of teaching, academic teaching, was happening? I think that's all I wanted to share with you about that. This came from your photo collection here at the Blair County Historical Society. This is the little depot where the students came. So what I want to read to you is they were placed on the train with bride and Bob. Their family said goodbye to them. They rode all day, all night, all day, and they arrived in Altoona. And then I believe a train switch happened, and there was a little layover in Altoona. And during that time, I wanted to read to you a little bit about the Altoona people's reaction. Let me find that, excuse me. So we have this from an Altoona Times reporter. We know that the people of Altoona were allowed to board the train, and they were allowed to look. That isn't the word that they used in the article, at the young people. And we have a comment that dusky children, and dusky is referring to skin color, attracted considerable attention. Many of our citizens gaining access to the car to gaze at them. So as I picture this in my mind and think about these children leaving their family, not really understanding they're going to be gone for many years. So they're leaving their family, they're put on a train with one gentleman overseeing 49 young people who are likely afraid, I would guess. I'm assuming most of them had never been on a train before. They ride on this long ride, they get into Altoona, people start boarding the train to look at them. They're placed on a new train, they're brought into Martinsburg, and when they arrive in Martinsburg, they are introduced to the life of the boarding school. Once in Martinsburg, we know that their very first week of school, this was in the Herald, the school system was the great attraction. According to Professor Breidenbaugh and teachers, we were daily visited by crowds of children and adults. The poor Indian could not understand why he was a curiosity. Okay. And next one, sorry, that's my fault. Then in August of 1885, Breidenbaugh, I assume the school is not profiting financially the way that he wanted it to. He tries for a second contract. That second contract is with the Osage Nation youth, but he's not going all the way to the Osage Reservation, which is out in the Oklahoma Territory at that time. He actually works it out with the U.S. Bureau of Indian Affairs to take the Osage that are already at the Carlisle School and transport them just from Carlisle over to Martinsburg. And that causes lots of little issues that I'm sure Frank will chat about that a little bit. Let me catch up to my notes. We're almost done here for my portion. The interesting thing is these youth had been at Carlisle for some of them 6 months or a year, but some of them up to 3 or 4 years. Some of the older ones actually ended up, when they came from the Oklahoma Territory to Carlisle, they stopped in Martinsburg. Something happened to the train, and they actually had to spend the night in Martinsburg. So 8 of the students that ended up coming to Martinsburg several years before, spent a night in Martinsburg. We would love to know a little bit more about that, but we don't. So of these youth transferred, 31 are males, 10 are females, and as I said, they are much older than you would expect. Many of them are in their late teens, their early 20s, up to as late as 27. And you can imagine what it was like at a school with some 7-year-olds to have 18-year-old men who had a very, very different lifestyle back in their home, where they were hunting and they were gathering and they were protecting their people and they were even maybe on war parties, and they were coming to Martinsburg to sit in desks and to learn. They're learning at about second and third grade level, and to also receive some vocational training. It was a recipe for a lot of discontent.
So this is the one and only photograph we have of the student body of the school. This photograph is taken around 1886. We know this from the number of students that are here. We're able to track through newspaper articles, believe it or not, and correspondence, exactly when students are leaving the school. There's never another big influx of students to the Martinsburg Indian School after 1885. This photograph was very elusive for us. We had a very fuzzy and grainy and darkened scan of a microfilm of a local newspaper article that had a reproduction of this image in it. And for the longest time, we were trying to figure out where it was and where it was. And the first time that I had ever come to the town of Martinsburg, I go to the Martinsburg Community Library, to the history room back there. I can't find it anywhere. I'm going to leave the room and I go, oh, I should sign in just to note that I'm here in the guest book, and hanging right above the guest book is the photograph. So that's one of those coincidental things you oftentimes encounter when you're doing this kind of research. We know that the man standing over here in the dark suit at the very left hand is Philip Henry Breidenbauer. We know that on the left-hand porch in the background is his wife Catherine, along with some of their children. And we know that on the second porch in the dark suits are a number of the instructors. A number of the instructors at the Martinsburg Indian School were local residents of the town of Martinsburg. So this really becomes a community event and activity of operating this school. It's not just Breidenbauer and his family, it extends past that. And this is really important to consider, again, given the size of this school. We talked about the fact that, Martinsburg is a small town, and so in addition to the fact that you now have an influx of indigenous youth in a town that for generations did not know Native American peoples at all, you also have those same townsfolk who are involved in the operations of the school in a variety of different ways. When we talk about the curriculum of the Martinsburg School, as I mentioned, like so many things, it is modeled after the model or the curriculum that comes out of the Carlisle Indian School. So it's a half-day industrial training program and a half-day academic training program. So for the first part of the day, students are being trained in a variety of trades that are broken down on Euro-American gendered lines. So boys are being taught agriculture and farming, they're being taught things like blacksmithing, tinsmithing, carpentry, and girls are being taught sewing, baking, laundry, housekeeping, very divided according to the way that gender roles are divided in the United States amongst European descended peoples around this time. It's also important to note here that this training was eventually meant to then have these students work on what are known as outings in the local town. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but suffice it to say here that the idea was that the students would be introduced to trades while at the school, and then they would be sent to go work in the town or in the surrounding county. The other half of the curriculum is academic training, the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic, only one of which is spelled with an R, as well as drawing and history. And this is, again, as we noted, exclusively Euro-American. It is designed to erase indigenous knowledge. It is designed to not talk about all of the different elements of indigeneity that these youth would have been exposed to in their education back in their home regions. And we know that students are punished for speaking in any language other than English, right? So this is part of this goal towards assimilating these indigenous youth so that they are no longer considered to be Native American. A big part of that drips through the entirety of the curriculum is Christianization. The Martinsburg Indian School is not tied to any single denomination, but religion, specifically Christianity, is used as a means of assimilating indigenous youth. This starts back on the reservations when missionary groups are in charge of many of the day schools that these students already would have gone to. And there's a lot of ties between the Martinsburg Indian School and a number of local churches, which is always important to sort of keep in mind. There's a number of different connections between the Martinsburg Indian School and the broader county, so sort of now expanding outside of our idea of Martinsburg as a town and getting outside to Hollidaysburg, which is the nearest major settlement, Altoona, where we are now, and Blair County. The first one is what I had mentioned previously about the outings. So the indigenous children that are at the Martinsburg Indian School are placed on these outings to local households, to local farms, and to local businesses. This is sometimes paid work. Sometimes it is not. Sometimes the school is gaining some sort of economic benefit from the students being there, and they pass that on in some part to the students. More often than not, however, it is free labor for a local town. And this comes into stark relief when we think of this, which is a spring-tooth harrow, which somebody had to explain to me because I'm not from an agricultural background, but it is a farming implement, and the spring-tooth harrow company of Martinsburg is established by a local man by the name of George Gorsuch, who then sells it to Philip Henry Breidenbaugh. So the students that are in the Martinsburg Indian School being trained by the Breidenbaugh family, and the US government is paying the Breidenbaugh family to educate them, are then being outed out to free labor for the company that is making him money on the side. Right, so when we talk about the role of these schools not only in assimilating indigenous youth, but also in the labor that you can extract from indigenous bodies, that's a really important thing that we have to keep in mind. The Spring-Tooth Harrow Company is the company that we know many of the students are working with, but they're also being placed on outings in farms across the region. And the school is actually renting some agricultural land to then have students work on it, to then supplement their food, because that means that it's cheaper to feed the students, and there's more money available for the family. There's also a really important connection with this idea of entertainment. So Jody mentioned some of the elements of media when the students are first coming into this area, where again, local residents have not encountered indigenous peoples for generations, and now all of a sudden you have train cars of indigenous children coming through. And this sparks a lot of interest. And so one of the first things that Breidenbaugh arranges with the community here in Blair County on the larger scale is for the students to be exhibited at the local county fair. So this is something that is very common in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. When you think of things like the World's Fair, like the Columbian Exposition in Chicago, this happens there as well. But basically these Native American children from the Osage and from the Oneida are put in costumes because they are stripped of their indigenous clothing, if they have any, when they've gotten to the school. They're put in costumes, they're given clay bow and arrows that they then make and then sell to local children in the region. And it's meant to be, they're meant to be there as objects of interest to those who have never seen real live Indians, right? So these are human beings on display at a county fair. And that happens at least 2 times in the 3 years that the school is operating. The last major connection to note here is the religious connection, which I did touch on. There are connections with a variety of local churches in Martinsburg for the sort of day-to-day and week-to-week religious activities the students are partaking in. But there are a couple of different examples of times when the children actually are brought by the Breidenbachs into Altoona for large religious events. And so this is one example where about 70 students, so a large proportion, the majority of the student body, are put on a train. They come out to Altoona to attend a special service at St. Luke's Church. So if we were at the Railroaders Museum, where these lectures normally take place, St. Luke's is like a block and a half away. And 17 students are actually confirmed in that service by a bishop of that church. So again, we're talking about connections that go beyond just, they're on the town and we're seeing them they're on the streets and we're seeing them walking around in town sometimes. These Osage and Oneida youth are being taken to churches locally and sitting next to the population, right? This is not just a school that's out there that nobody's having any interaction with. They're embedded in the local community. And this is something that is in some ways very unique for schools like this, which is one of the really interesting things that I keep coming back to when I study the Martinsburg School. As you heard in the introduction that Jim gave me, I am a medical historian by background, so I had to put some of this in. Also because it is really important to consider the health of students. So there's a physician in the town of Martinsburg by the name of D.W. Bonebreak, which I always think is interesting because the first mention I ever saw of physician Bonebreak was he was setting somebody's broken arm. Nominative determinism at its finest. And so we know that he is a local town physician and he's being paid by the Breidenbachs to help with the health of students. We know that there are a number of disease outbreaks that happen at the school. This is partially because of the fact that you have children that are from different disease environments, right? Different places where they're not exposed to the same contagions, being suddenly brought together in an institution where they're sleeping very closely. Hygiene is not great because it's not being provided for very well, and because they're teenagers, and if anyone's ever dealt with teenagers, you know how hygiene can sort of slip sometimes. And so a variety of different conditions go through the school over the course of 3 years. We know that in December 1885 alone, that the majority of students, well, not the majority, but a large portion of the students come down with the mumps. There are rashes, there are sore eyes, which is trachoma, which is a contagious eye disease that will lead to blindness that is going through the school. There's pneumonia, and then there is a mention of scrofula, which is another name for tuberculosis. Tuberculosis, at this point, is one of the biggest killers of indigenous peoples in North America, and it runs through schools very easily because tuberculosis is transmitted through a number of different ways, but most often pneumatically through the breath, right? We know that there are 3 deaths that happen that are tied to the Martinsburg Indian School. One Oneida student is transported back to the Oneida agency, and in that student's case, the Breidenbaus actually put that student on a train, take them back to the Oneida Reservation so that they can die with their family. By the time Breidenbau gets back to Martinsburg, that student has died. There are also 2 Osage youth that die while attending the Martinsburg School, and they're buried in the Fairview Cemetery in Martinsburg, which is, if you're familiar with that main road on which Morrison's Cove Memorial Park is, and you keep driving out of town that way, that cemetery is right there on your, I want to say your right-hand side. Am I on the right road?
It's on Market Street.
Oh, okay. I'm not from this area, so this is based on my recollection of Martinsburg from being there 2 years ago, so don't hold me to directions of the town. There's a reason why I didn't do that portion. We also know that there is a death recorded in the Reformed church records of the area, but we don't have any other corroboration for that death. And so we list it as a potential additional death, just because church records especially, they often get filled in retroactively, and we haven't really been able to tie any particular individual's details to that death. But it is important to note that at a school where a max enrollment was 89 individuals, at least 3 die over the course of 3 years. So the school is operating from 1885 when it stops to 1888. And there are a number of different reasons that are given for its closure, or that are sort of participating in its closure. One of the largest is a letter that comes from 18 parents of 20 Oneida youth that are at the school, who send a letter to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, who is the individual in charge of the entire system in the American Empire, saying that they want their children sent home. And that letter goes on to talk about the fact that they feel like they're not being educated properly, they feel like they're being put at risk because of their health, they feel like they're being exploited because of free labor, right? So all the things that we mentioned previously. And it's also important to note that the Osage parents are creating equal pressure towards the federal government. And it's going on for years, right? There's a lot of parental pressure against the Martinsburg Indian School, basically from the start. A number of parents are very wary about the institution. There's also a number of tensions with Superintendent Pratt, who is the founder and superintendent of the Carlisle Indian School. So Jody mentioned that the Osage youth that are at Martinsburg were transfers from the Carlisle Indian School. Carlisle is the nearest Indian school to Martinsburg, and so there's a lot of interconnections. Pratt actually helps Breidenbau by giving him letters of reference and support for creating the Martinsburg Indian School, and then very quickly that relationship sours. And at one point, Pratt basically says that Breidenbau is everything that is wrong with the Indian school system. So very quickly, they grow apart, and Pratt is much more powerful in terms of politicians in Washington than Breidenbau is. Ultimately, the contracts are not renewed. So the contracts are not canceled by the federal government, but the federal government just says, we're not going to let you keep doing this. So according to the story that is told by Breidenbau and told by Pratt in different correspondence, the students are allowed to choose whether they are going to return back home to their corresponding agencies or they're going to transfer to the Carlisle Indian School. 32 transfer to Carlisle and 12 return home. Obviously, those numbers are a lot smaller than that 89 that we mentioned, and that's because by this time, the school is emptying out quickly because students are deserting, because students are being sent home in 1s and 2s by parents because of death, and because there's so much parental pressure that's going on that oftentimes to appease a parent or a family, the federal government will actually order a student to be sent back home. So the school, the Martinsburg Indian Training School, closes in 1888. In 1889 and by 1889 and 1890, Breidenbauer is trying to reopen the Juniata Collegiate Institute, and by this time, the demographics of the town have not changed. There's still not a ton of students left to educate, and most of them that could have been educated are now going to other institutions, right? So he tries that for a few years, it doesn't work. He ends up opening up a temporary almshouse in the space after a fire occurs in the county's purpose-built almshouse. It then becomes an industrial home for orphan children. It then transitions into being a hotel, and there's actually a postcard that I noticed on the table up here of the building as a hotel. So that operates for a number of years. And then eventually the building is razed in the mid-1940s. And then that area is built up with homes. And so today you really wouldn't even know that that building was there. I did mention that 2 Osage youth are buried in the Fairview Cemetery. For the longest time, they were buried in unmarked spaces. They were buried in what was known as the pauper section. So anyone who was poor that could not afford a burial, they would have been put either in a burlap sack, or they would have been put in a very simple box and just placed in an unmarked grave in the very far corner of the cemetery. A retired school teacher in the 1970s, around the time of the bicentennial, then created this movement to mark that pauper section where roundabout those graves may be. She tells a story of her mother playing with some of the girls that went to the school. This is all coming from articles dating from the bicentennial. And so she works with local school children and businesses in fundraising to erect this monument stone. There are a number of factual inaccuracies here. There's a depiction of a Native American person, which is also not factually accurate in any way, shape, or form on this monument. And the monument names the students, but it also recognizes the Indian School supervisor, Professor P.H. Breidenbauer, and his wife, Catherine, who, as we've heard by now, are sort of integral to the running of the school. It's really important when we talk about the Martinsburg Indian School to also recognize its connections in the state of Pennsylvania and beyond. So we are up there. No, sorry. I'm doing this from an angle, so I appreciate all the help. So right there, that red marker is the Martinsburg Indian School. Many of the markers overlap. But basically, this map helps to outline, at least here in Pennsylvania, the different institutions that are tied into this system of Indigenous education. There are 3 boarding schools that operate in the state of Pennsylvania, or what is now the state of Pennsylvania: the Martinsburg School, the Carlisle School, and then the Lincoln Institute that's based in Philadelphia. We also know that there are schools across the state that are educating Indigenous children because they're being sent from the Carlisle School on outing so they can continue their education. And a number of the state-run institutions, Apache institutions, Shippensburg, Millersville, Kutztown, Indiana, IUP, they're all sort of involved in that. There's also nursing schools that are happening, and other schools, one in Chambersburg and one in Gettysburg, that try to follow the same model that Breidenbauer does, and they never even get off the ground, right? So this is not just a coincidental thing. This is something that is much larger than Blair County. It extends to the entirety of the state. And it extends to the entirety of the American Empire. So this is a map from the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, which is a group that is doing a lot of this research. This is an old map. It lists 367 schools. For those of you that are New York Times readers, you may have seen in the last few weeks there was a large feature piece about the Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. They've identified around 500 or so schools now. So it's a very large system that the federal government is operating. It's being operated in tandem with missionary groups. And so it's all part of this larger history, and one that we can't forget, right? It's a history that goes beyond this region, and so the Martinsburg Indian Training School is a really great way for us to think about the national trends that are happening in terms of Indigenous history and how our local region, your local region, is really tied into that. And it's important to also remember that in addition to these schools being placed across what is now the contiguous United States and Alaska, we also have these schools that are educating Indigenous youth from across the American Empire. So this picture in the background is from the Carlisle Indian School, but it's a really great way to sort of highlight the fact that when we go back to that image of all the children standing outside the Martinsburg Indian Training School, they are coming from two specific regions, two specific tribes. But every single Indigenous group that exists in the late 19th and early 20th centuries is implicated in some way or another in this educational assimilationist program, right? And so it's not just Indigenous peoples in the American West, but it's displaced peoples from all over. And with that said, we just want to end with this sort of final pitch, because oftentimes we find that people know a little bit more of the individual bits and pieces from their own family history than we do. And this is where I'm going to hand it off to Jody, because Jody's done some of this work.
In the December 1885 article, we have a listing of every Native American youth who was here at that time. We also have a listing of every single townsperson that was somehow supporting the school, either as an educator or as a vocational instructor, maybe as a cook, as a housekeeper. So we have that list of about 15 people, and when we do every presentation, we come to you and say, do you know these people? Now, I know the majority of you are not from Martinsburg. We've had really no one come forward to say, yes, that's my family, or we're hoping that somewhere in an attic in Martinsburg, there are so many interesting pieces of the history of this, because really what we've gleaned has come from the newspaper articles primarily and the work that Frank did at the National Archives. So we do have that list. We can get it to you in some specific way. We didn't want to spend a lot of time going through who that is. But if you are, especially from Martinsburg, if you want to talk with us, we'll go over that with you. Right here is actually a pen and ink drawing of a young man who that was given to an instructor at the Indian School, and it ended up hanging in the Skiles family home for many years. And we know even into the 1940s and 1950s it hung there. We cannot find it since then. The family, we're losing connections to the family, but we believe there are things like that laying around in Martinsburg somewhere in the Martinsburg area. So we'd love to have you.
And with that, we want to thank you so much for your time.
Yes.
This is obviously something that we are very interested in, and at this point, whatever questions you may have, you seem like very engaged and interested group, so hopefully we have some good questions. And I'm not sure how we want to run questions, if we want to pass microphones or
Give me one microphone, I can run
if this one stays on.
I'll go ahead and take the microphone.
Yeah.
Okay, raise your hand for your questions.
I know that a lot of the tribes have asked for their remains of the people to be returned. Have anybody thought of coming to the Martinsburg one?
So our team was in contact with the Osage Tribal Historic Preservation Office, which is the body within the Osage Nation that handles repatriations. At this time, that is not something that they are looking to pursue as a nation. And that is something that I believe that they are hoping to handle on a family-by-family basis if those families would like to pursue that. It's important to note that the Osage and the Oneida are independent sovereign nations. They're independent agencies, entities of themselves that are not really related to each other in governance structure or anything like that. So what one group does is not necessarily precedential to another, but that is, as of our last conversations with them, their hope.
One small thing. We did have can you hear me?
I think this microphone keeps
Okay.
cutting in and
We
out.
had a visitation from a member of the Osage tribe. She previously was a council member. She actually had run for the president of the tribe, was defeated in that position. She came as an interested person, not as a representative of the government. She did come, we took her of a tour of the area, we took her to the grave site, and she prayed about it. She gave that information back to the tribe as well. Frank and I and Corey have worked very hard to make sure the tribal nations know what we know. We have shared everything that we have with them, anything they have wanted. And it has always been my heart that if they wanted those children to be returned, that they would know so that they could do that if that was their desire.
Are there any known descendants of students who attended the school?
Not that we are aware of, at least in this area. So in the Carlisle and Cumberland County region, there are descendants from the Carlisle Indian School that are still in that area. But as I mentioned, that school is much larger. Over the course of 40 years, the Carlisle Indian School educates about 8,000 Indigenous youth. In this area, we're not aware of anyone, but that does not mean that descendants are not in this area. But I pose the Carlisle example because, as I mentioned, the students who are remaining at Martinsburg in 1888, the large majority of them transfer back to the Carlisle Indian School. We have not traced every single individual that went to the school, but it is quite possible that somebody's in this area, but not likely, probably.
We had a grandfather that was raised with his brother at the Williamsburg School that you mentioned might have joined into that building at some point in time. Do you have a specific time period? Because I know there was a big fire at the Williamsburg orphanage, and a lot of the records are gone.
Yeah, so that is after the school is dissolved. So that happens in the 1890s is when that fire happens. So it's after the time that the school is dissolved.
You said that
Breidenbach.
Breidenbach was paid per student?
Yes.
How much was each student?
It depends. It depends on the contract. So there are a couple of different contracts that are operating, and very interestingly, Osage students are worth more than Oneida students. These are rates that are set by the federal government for all schools, and they have huge tables in Washington in the National Archives where they basically track out what they will give for each student. That's tied to...
Each tribe had a different price?
Yes. There have been studies that have looked at why that's the case. The leading argument for why they're doing that differential pricing is because certain groups are more or less troublesome for white settlement, and so the idea is that if we can incentivize schools to take children from tribes and nations that are more oppositional, especially more violently oppositional to white settlement, then that will encourage those schools to accept more of those youth. There's also a tie-in with transportation as well and transportation costs, because basically that per capita is meant to cover everything. A student's transport to and from their home reservation, all of their medical care, all of their food, all of their supplies, the salaries of everybody, and this is why, by and large, the Indian schools are not well staffed, they're not well resourced, and they're not well built. Many of them end up in either buildings like the Martinsburg School, where it had been a school and then it transitions into being another school. The Carlisle Indian School is started in an old abandoned barracks. So the money is also tied to all of the different things that the federal government is trying to pencil in to say this is how much we think it is going to cost and this is the rate that we're going to pay.
Do you have a rate of any of the?
I do.
I'm just curious.
I don't have them in front of me, but we do have them. We can track that. We actually have some of the contracts that Breidenbauer was signing with the government to say, I'm going to have this many students at this rate. It's also important to note that Breidenbauer is always saying, I need more money, right? I know that this is a per capita rate. I can't do it for that much. I need more money, right? This is something that he's not alone in. Many school administrators and many different institutions are saying the per capitas are not enough. And so that is also sort of taking play in. Yeah.
Was there a different rate?
Sorry, there's a microphone there.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
One of the very last photographs that you showed had the people, and then they had their affiliation with the tribe. And one of these says Puerto Rico. What are we supposed to think about that?
So I kept saying the American Empire. And I was saying that very purposefully. These schools were not limited to individuals that are now in what we consider the United States proper. So we know that at the Carlisle School, there are youth from Puerto Rico, from the Philippines, and from Mexico that are at that institution, in addition to Alaska Natives, in addition to individuals from across the contiguous United States. The only individuals that don't end up at the Carlisle School, to our knowledge so far, are Native Hawaiians. And that's because Hawaii is sort of coming in at the tail end, right? So when I say Puerto Rico, and I have that here, it is because there are Puerto Rican students that are being put on steamships and brought up to the United States to be educated in these schools. As I said, Martinsburg, I keep touching the button. As I said, Martinsburg does not have anyone except from the Osage and the Oneida, but many of these other schools do. And Breidenbauer himself is trying to say, well, look, this is, there's war going on across the Rio Grande in Mexico. Maybe some of those people could come here to be educated, right? He's constantly trying to play into this fact that America as an empire is expanding, and he's trying to capitalize on that.
When they're figuring out the per capita, is there a different amount for females and males and age range?
It depends on the year and it depends on the contract. There are differences that are spelled out. Oftentimes it's done by age because the idea is that it's cheaper to feed a child who is 8 than a child that is 18. Keep hitting that button. But yes, there are some distinctions that are made there in the per capita. But I'm not entirely sure the exact details offhand of the Martinsburg contracts.
There's a question way in the back.
Has there been any accounts from the kids at the school?
So there's one letter that we identified in, so we keep saying the National Archives. So the National Archives and Records Administration down in Washington, D.C. maintains a variety of different types of records about these Indian schools. However, the Martinsburg Indian School is not federally run, so they don't maintain the records from that school. We do not have the administrative records from the Martinsburg Indian School. What we do have are letters sent by parents and by students to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs. There's one letter that is from a student in the student's hand that is very graphic about the mistreatment that's occurring at the school. And we've been asked by the nation not to share the contents of that letter because of the sensitive nature of what it contains. But it is, there's a reason why the Commissioner of Indian Affairs shuts down a school when he's opening tons of others across the American Empire. And I'll just leave it there. Oh, yeah.
Well, I guess the microphone isn't working. We also have the voice of the students in the Martinsburg Herald, and it's the only time we do have the voice of the students. It actually is a sad kind of little section. Two of them were caught stealing from the larder, and they were asked to write letters of apology, talking about that they would never do it again. So that was actually published in the paper with their names. However, one of the young people was very, very contrite, and he was very apologetic, and he said how much he enjoyed being at the school, how sorrowful he was, and that he wanted to be able to stay. But that is our only little snippet beyond what we found in the archives.
Yeah, and of course the newspaper is being published by a friend of Breidenbauer who is, you know, a local townsperson, right? So it's not the sort of pure, unfiltered voice of a student there.
I learned this evening that the students, the ages of the students
Yes.
at the schools were much older than I thought they were.
Yes.
How long was the typical stay for a student at one of these schools?
It really depends. So many of the younger children that are sent to schools like Martinsburg are orphans. And the idea is that the schools are basically going to operate in loco parentis, right? For the older students, the standard federal term was either 3 or 5 years for a contract. And the idea behind that was that in that time you could either show substantial progress or they would cancel the contract. There are individuals who spend their entire lives in the Indian school systems. And there are also individuals who are there for a week and then they're discharged or they run away because they're trying to escape from these conditions. It really varies. And it also varies on time period. So in the 1880s, terms of duration are actually a lot longer than they are in like the 1910s, 1920s.
Did the Indian families actually have an option to keep their children at home, or were they
Not.
voluntold to go?
They were often voluntold, is a good word. There are many accounts of the agents that are operating, the Indian agents that are operating the reservation, saying to families, if you don't send your child, we're withholding your rations, we're withholding your allotment funds, or, you know, there's going to be punishments. But we also know that there are families who purposefully send their children to these schools. There are individuals who go to these schools as youth and then send their children, so it's a multi-generational occurrence. We know also that there are individuals who lie about being Native American to get into these schools because they don't have opportunities for free education elsewhere, right? So they're very complex institutions, but there's, depending on the individual tribe or nation, depending on the politics of the day, depending on the institution, sometimes it's very voluntary and sometimes it's very forced. And to the point that at the Carlisle Indian School, there's a large group of prisoners of war that are brought there in chains. So it's a very different type of experience.
Yeah, there's a very long obituary that's in the newspaper for Henry Beecher. And I'm sure it's written by Professor Breidenbauer, and it's a glowing report of this young man's life. So I think there were a lot of good experiences at the school. You don't read, anything really bad in any of the centennial books or anything. It's all positive. about the Indian School. And I think it is actually remarkable that only 3 died in 3 years with the lack of medicines and everything that was available, and the kids in this close proximity. I think they did a great job there when you hear of other epidemics killing, hundreds of Indians at a time.
And Randy, I did want to add a piece to that. There is something very remarkable about the fact in Martinsburg the children's death was commemorated. So as you listen to some of the stories right now of graves that have been unmarked, have been suddenly found at boarding schools where many children have died, it wasn't acknowledged and they were buried. At least we know about these children in Martinsburg. They actually visited the graves of the young people during the time that they were at school. We have accounts on Memorial Day going up. We know there was Christian burial. We know the children participated in that. We know then later in the 1970s, the community marked it. I'll leave that to your decision what that means. But to me, I take some comfort that at least we recognize that they were there and we commemorated them. We did not hide them away as is happening at some of the other schools, or at least we don't know if that happened.
The one thing that I would just put out there is that up until we started going into the archives, the only source of information about the school was published in the local newspapers. And so the local newspapers are going to be very positive because they're owned by Breidenbau and his friends.
That's your opinion, but there was an article just in the paper the other day where a musician came back who was taught music at the school, and he came back and played in an orchestra. And he had a very positive experience at Martinsburg.
As I said, these schools are very complex. There are absolutely individuals who had positive experiences at these institutions, and there's a lot of work that shows that. One of the most striking things about these schools is that in the same breath, the same individuals will talk about this school as being equal to Harvard and equal to internment camps. And this is the voice of students, and this is the voice of people who are talking about what their parents told them about these institutions as well. It's not cut and dry, right? History is never, as much as we like this black and white, history is not cut and dry. And any attempt to make it cut and dry is, quite frankly, not doing a good service to history, because these are complicated, very diverse perspectives. You're dealing with 89 individuals who are at this school as enrolled students, plus all of the people in the town of Martinsburg and the county of Blair County here, the politicians that are involved, the parents, the religious missionaries that are involved. There are hundreds of people involved in this, and just like there are 70-some different sentiments and viewpoints in this room, this is what we found in our research, and that is up to your interpretation, how you take it. So.